Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. Today, we are honoring a creator who is very famous. If you don't know who he is, he's Paul Toscano, and he was one of the September 6. If you don't know who those people are, look them up and find out more. Welcome, Paul, to our show.
We've got an OG troublemaker here, and this is pre-internet days as well.
That's right.
Yes, in the days of books and paper.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit about my background, just quickly, so that people who don't know me might get grounded. I'm Paul Toscano. I was one of the September 6 excommunicated within the month of September of 1993. And we were all believers. We were all excommunicated basically by the connivance of Boyd Packer. And it's a very interesting story. I don't think that I'll get into it right now, but that's probably sadly, my claim to fame is to be thrown out of the church, essentially for insubordination. But I was born in Brooklyn, New York, which could possibly explain why I was insubordinate. I mean, if you're born in New York, you tend to be a little bit confrontative.
And I was born in the church.
Oh, I was born outside the church in 1943. Right. I was a Catholic and a lapsed Catholic. My family were lapsed Catholic. And they moved to California in 52. I started the public schools there in 52 in the third grade. I went to high school in 59 and graduated in 63. In high school, I was converted to Mormonism. And then in September of 63, actually is on September 19th of 1963, I entered BYU. I say September 19th, 63, because on September 19th of 93, I was excommunicated from the church. So it's kind of an interesting 30 years.
Like anniversary present.
Right. It was 30 years in and 31 years out now.
How did you get to choose? How did you come to choose BYU? When did you become Mormon?
I became Mormon I was baptized in March of 1963. And then in high school, I did poorly. I wasn't thinking about going to college. And if college crossed my mind, it would have been California college, like LA State or something like that. I wasn't that much of a book guy when I was in high school. I wasn't frivolous. I was just nobody ever in my family went to college. Nobody went, high school. Some of them never went to high school, so we were not that educated. I did go to BYU, and I did poorly at BYU in my first years academically, although I became very familiar with Mormon history and Mormon theology because I took all of the classes that I could because I was interested in learning about my religion. But I didn't do well academically until I came back from my mission in Italy. I went in 1966 to Italy when it was one mission, and I returned in 1969. And then between 1969 and 1970, I earned a bachelor's degree and got enough good grades that I raised my grade point average high enough that I could get into graduate school. And then between 70 and 72, I earned a master's degree in English literature, where I did studies in Shakespeare's tragedies. I had a thesis that I completed. And from that thesis, I wrote my first academic article on Measure for Measure, Shakespeare's problem play called Measure for Measure. It was published in BYU Studies. The editor then was Chuck Tate. And in fact, I've got a copy of the
nice.
And it appears in this issue of BYU Studies. It appeared, oddly enough, in the same issue where Mike Quinn published his first academic paper on the succession crisis in the Mormon Church that happened at the death of Joseph Smith in August of 1844, when the church was trying to decide whether to go with Sidney Rigdon or somebody else, and who was the successor to Joseph Smith. Well, his article.
So that's a collector's item. You're saying that one.
The same one. In fact, I didn't have a copy. A few weeks ago, I found it online and I ordered it because I didn't have a copy of one. I'm not an historian. I later went to law school and became a lawyer, and I was a consumer bankruptcy lawyer for years. I was a bankruptcy trustee for years. And that involves a lot of litigation, chasing paper and reading cases and analyzing that. So my writing really, I have a number of different genres I've written across. And actually I had to write them down because I hadn't thought about it this way, but I've done academic writing. As I said, that was one. I did another article on encryption for the encryption in the virtual world, which I wrote in 2000, which appeared in the John Marshall, about the twin key encryption system that works to protect the internet. I wrote an article on the Supreme Court's establishment clauses cases called Invisible Religion in the Public Schools. It appeared in the BYU Law Review. I've written essays and speeches, a memoir, theological exegeses. I've written several novels, documentary scripts. I wrote a documentary with Brian Capener back in 1980 called The Doomsayers, which won a regional Emmy. And
so how did you?
I've written hymn texts.
Was there ever an idea that you would get in trouble for any of your writings? Did you feel like a renegade at any point, or you know what I mean? Do you when you got to the point like leading up to the September 6th happening, did you feel like?
Yeah, I did. I knew that I was treading on thin ice. I was aware of that. But I felt like I had to, because I felt like the church had gotten off course. If you think of a clock, right, and where the handles of the clock meet at the center, well, if you're off course and you take it out to the edges, you're going to wind up completely
pretty far away.
Wrong. It's like lately they've been saying, well, the conviction of Trump is causing a shift of 2%. Well, 2% doesn't sound like much when you're at the center of the clock. It's a small percentage number. But if you carry it out to the population, it's 400, it's 4 million votes.
Right.
It could be 8 million votes. It's a huge difference. So I felt the church was off course, and I'll explain why later. But I started writing. The first thing I wrote, which got some, stir, was an article in the Daily Universe called The Behavioral Heresy, because I was attacking the idea that the purpose of the gospel was to make bad men good and good men better. And I thought, well, that isn't the purpose of the gospel. That's the purpose of the law. The purpose of the gospel is spiritual transformation. It isn't about getting people to obey. It's getting people to be changed.
Couldn't that be a way to say that that's how one would make bad men good and good men better? Is the spiritual transformation?
Yeah, because it makes it transactional. So the relationship with God becomes, I'm going to do these good things so I can get your blessing. So it becomes like putting a penny in a slot. It's not based on love. It's a transactional version of the gospel. And I could see that
Nelson. President Nelson
is deeply involved in a transactional gospel.
Yeah, he said something about how God will love you more if you take on the covenant.
See, he wrote, I questioned him in public back in 1993 in April. He gave this ridiculous speech in priesthood meeting about how God's love is conditional. And I wrote an article. It appears online, or you can get it at Sunstone. And I said, look, the problem with Elder Nelson is he doesn't differentiate between God's love and God's approval. Those are two different things. I mean, I love my children all the time, but I don't always approve about what they do. But that has nothing to do with my love for them. Approval and love are two different things. And he cannot make this distinction because he's essentially a surgeon. I mean, doctors aren't used to critical thinking. They memorize body parts and get in there and cut into people and close them up.
That's right. You either need your appendix or it needs to come out.
Right. It's an inner out proposition for him. And so he doesn't make these.
I didn't know that he did that in 1993.
Oh, yes.
Because he did that again recently.
Yes.
Well, I say recently, I want to say 2012, but it might be even more recent than that. It's interesting that all these things, that goes also with his hatred for the word Mormon, that goes back, way back, and then he's reiterating. So that's really interesting to me that he was kind of, that was one of his things. I like the word Mormon is this idea of God's love being conditional.
Yeah, as a junior apostle, you don't get your way very often.
It's revelation by regurgitation is what it is. He keeps regurgitating the same thing that he was chastised for. I mean, Gordon Hinckley basically chastised Russell Nelson for condemning the word Mormon. He said, no, I mean, Elder Nelson thinks it's a bad idea, but I think it's wrong because we've had the word Mormon since Joseph Smith and we can't monkey around with it now. Let's just accept it. But Russell Nelson has this idea that by changing the emphasis of the name of the church, it makes it more Christian. But while they're putting the name of Christ and the logo and all of at the same time, they are abandoning the teachings of Jesus while basically doing this propaganda thing about emphasizing his name more. So they draw near them with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. That's exactly what's happening.
That's interesting to me that goes way back. So the talk Divine Love was in 2003, so just a correction on that. But let's get back to what you were saying about that. So in 1993, did he get any pushback like with the word Mormon on his God's love is conditional thing, or was it mainly you? And remind me where it was that you had published your pushback.
The pushback first appeared in a newsletter called Common Consent, which you can find online. And then it appeared later in one of my books of essays. I think it was either The Sanctity of Dissent or The Sacrament of Doubt. They were published by Signature Books. So in one of those books, it appears in the book. I think it also appeared as an article in Sunstone, although I don't have a clear recollection of that, but I think it did. And you can find it online, my rebuttal.
So that's where it started, you would say?
No, as I said, but that was in 93, early in 93 when I wrote that, just a few months before I was excommunicated. My contention with the leaders of the church began in around 1972, when I wrote the article for the Deseret News called The Behavioral Heresy, where I was saying, look, the gospel is just more than a transactional gospel. It's more than trying to just change people's outward behavior. It's about an internal transformation. It's about getting people to have an intimate, personal relationship with Christ.
Were you a research assistant for Dallin Oaks at that time?
I became a research assistant for Dallin Oaks probably in 1978.
Okay, so a little bit later.
I graduated in 78. It might have been 1977 while I was in law school. Okay. He was president of BYU, and he needed somebody to help gather a bunch of information I can't even remember what it was. But, I was friendly with him, and he was friendly with me.
Sure. Because the most of the stuff you're doing from work.
I knew a lot of the leaders of the church. I had encounters with Harold B. Lee and Marion Hanks and Marion Romney, people like that. I knew who they were. And
because as a lawyer,
I had one encounter with Boyd Packer.
As a lawyer, you were actually future apostle material.
Well, I wanted to be an apostle. I thought I'd make a good one. I thought, I like theology and I like to talk, but I found out I had a conversation with L. Tom Perry. I was a friend of his son's, and I actually helped his son kind of get a testimony and go on a mission. When I was an editor of the Ensign, this was in 1972, I was one of the editors at the Ensign magazine, and I was sent to Boston to do a story on the Boston Saints, and that was when L. Tom Perry was a stake president. I stayed at his house, and on that weekend, his son returned from the mission, just that in Japan. We talked, and while I was there, I said, I have an inspiration I should pass on to you. President Perry, he was president of the stake. I said, I think you're going to get called to be a general authority. Well, I went back to Salt Lake and wrote the article called The Boston Saints and the Ensign. And that October, he was called to be an assistant to the 12.
There you go.
And he was so shocked by the fact that I had told him this ahead of time. He thought that I had some inside information or something. It wasn't. He came to my office at the Ensign, which was in the commercial club building at the time, because they hadn't finished the big church office building. He came over and was questioning me because he thought I had some kind of inside source. And I said, no, it's not an inside source. It was just
God told you.
I wouldn't go that far. It was just an intuition. I'm not willing to go that far. And say,
in a way, the two of you laid the groundwork for the future Boston Temple, probably, between your article and his leadership.
I don't know about that. I do know that I told him when he came to the office and he was an assistant to the 12, I said, you're going to become an apostle very soon. And he was. After he was an apostle, I went to his house and I was talking to him, and we were talking about it. I said, well, what do you talk about in the Council of the 12? I mean, what do? You talk about polygamy or theology or any of the things that I was kind of interested in exploring theologically. He said, oh, no, we never talk about anything like that. He says, we're just talking about the administration of the church, and we can barely get through the agenda just to do that. And I said, well, that's sad, I said. He said, no, I'm not sure we could agree. It's better that we focus on the administration. As I think that was his view. And I think that's what they mainly did.
I think your unwillingness to give God credit for your premonition is something that maybe could have lent you to becoming an apostle, but I guess your unwillingness to be a dishonest is something that maybe knocked you down a couple notches.
Well, my feeling is that, and I believe in the Lord. I believe in Jesus Christ. I mean, I admit this. I believe that he's the supreme being. I don't believe the idea that there's a Father and a Son and a Holy Ghost like the church teaches or even Catholicism teaches. And the reason I don't believe that is there are two. One, that's not the image of Christ that is in the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, Christ is both Father and Son. The Creator is the Redeemer. And the reason why I accept that rather than Trinitarianism or tritheism is because if Trinitarianism or tritheism is true, it means that the Father killed his Son to save his real estate. And that means that the entire atonement is based on a murder. It's based on a filicide. And I can't accept that. I believe that the Creator redeems his own creation. He doesn't leave the dirty work of the incarnation and the crucifixion to somebody else. And I think that's the principal message of the Book of Mormon. I think you can find very little in the Book of Mormon that you can't find in Christianity. But the two principal things I think you find in the Book of Mormon are the idea that Christ is the supreme being. It says it on the title page. The convincing of Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself to all nations. That's the thesis of the book. And then you find the other point, which I find extraordinary, which is in 2 Nephi 2 and 11, where Lehi says to his son, there must needs be an opposition in all things, which means that God is not fixed. Infinity is not fixed. There's within the infinite is the finite. Within the male is the female. Within the female is the male. Within, it's a peaks and troughs. It's constantly moving like yin and yang. Things are in motion, or else there would be no life. And this statement of Lehi's is in direct contradiction to the principal teachings of Zoroastrianism, which were also emerging in 600 BC. So I find that even though the Book of Mormon I don't think is necessarily an historical book, it is a book of significant theology based simply on those two ideas, which are never explored in Mormonism. Right. They're hardly touched on.
I remember getting the same lesson for 40 years in a row.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like being in the Army. You get, 1 year's 6 times.
You know what? I think it's interesting that you believe in monotheism, because it seems to me that some people would say, if you look at the design of the universe and the earth and the creatures on it, it looks like a committee might have done it.
Well, I think it is a committee. I think just because we believe the atonement was done by the Creator created a lot of things, and creating a committee, an Elohim, which is a council of divinities, I think is, it accords with ancient theological ideas. And I don't think to say that you start with an infinite uncreated being that created divinities. I think that's, if you look at the Psalm 82 or the Gospel of John, chapter 10, Jesus is quoting Psalm 82, where he talks about gods. And what is the whole point of Christianity but the creation of making humans equal? And the reason for this is because love cannot exist between subordinates and their superiors. Real love has to be based on equality. And so if Christ is about love, ultimately, he's looking to make us equal. And, it's a mystery how that happens. Well, he becomes equal to us so that we can become equal to him. That's the whole heart of the gospel. And the fact that the church wants to create classes you have the apostolic class and the 70 class and the high priest class and the elders and the teachers and deacons and women.
Even in heaven,
then,
the degrees of
it's
glory.
absurd. It's an absurd contradiction of the Christ teachings. And it has to be. And that's what led me to write. I mean, I felt like, the point of the crucifixion wasn't so that Christ died on the cross so that we could have bureaucracy.
So what was your first book?
Well, the first book that I wrote was called Gospel Letters to a Mormon Missionary. And it was an epistolary. And I actually wrote it because the church had hired me to write a manual for the missionaries at the MTC. But they didn't like the final product. And so what I did is I took the final product and turned it into an epistolary. And it was published as Gospel Letters to a Mormon Missionary. And it was that book.
Victory for Satan there.
That
the M word.
Dallin Oaks read that book and he disagreed with some of the things I said in it. And that's why I had the meeting with him in 1984, because he was a little concerned that I suggested that people could be ordained to the priesthood, even the apostleship, and not have an ounce of the Spirit in them and have none of the charismatic gifts. And I said, well, that's in the 121st section, that the rights of the priesthood are inseparably connected with the powers of heaven. But it also says that if you separate the rights from the powers of the Spirit, then amen to your priesthood. So it's not like, and he said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, you call mission presidents who are just salesmen. They have no concept of the gospel. And you don't worry about that. You worry about somebody who's got spiritual gifts that you haven't ordained. That's what you worry about, charisma that's gone out of control. But you don't seem to be worried about priests and high priests who are spiritually dead. And you put them in charge of missions. And then the missions fail and the missionaries come home disappointed. And, you're creating problems because you simply don't understand the gospel. You think the gospel is a series of, well, now they call them covenants, the covenant path. It's not about covenants. It's about the Spirit of God dwelling in us and changing us from the inside out. And that's not happening. That's why
This was when he was president of the university?
What?
When you had this conversation?
Was president.
As I said, I wrote the first article in 1972, and then I didn't write anything anymore until 1985. So between 1972 and 1985, I was silent. My wife, however, Margaret, wrote a seminal speech. She gave a seminal on priesthood, women in priesthood, called The Missing Rib, the Forgotten Place of Queens and Priestesses in the Establishment of Zion. And that was given at Sunstone in 1984. I was home babysitting the girls, and she gave the speech. And it was so powerful that they wanted her to give it the next day again. And so I got a babysitter, and so I heard her second delivery. And that was a seminal article because it dealt with Joseph Smith's promises to women given at the First Relief Society in 1842. And people hadn't analyzed his statements carefully. And he was promising women the same fullness of priesthood that he was hoping to give to the men through the temple endowment.
He wanted to make the Relief Society a kingdom of priests. Actually,
in one version that one woman gave that was there, she said to make us a kingdom of priestesses. So they're different.
To go back, I'm sorry. This is good stuff too, and there's a million ways. But when did you have the conversation? This first one with Oaks that he was troubled about. Was this before that, or was this? The
conversation was in 1984.
Okay, so this is
he became an apostle. I had been his research assistant in 1977, and then he went on the Supreme Court for a while of Utah, and then he became an apostle, and
that's actually
he was an apostle.
That's actually almost the whole reason he's not prophet now. Is his service on the Supreme Court wasn't quite done, and so Nelson jumped in ahead of him. Is that correct?
Yes, I would think so.
Oh, goodness.
And we have a doctor and a lawyer, but we don't have any.
Sounds like the start of a good joke.
It does, doesn't it? Doctor, a lawyer, a ladder, and a light bulb. You think,
I actually wonder, I'm curious your thoughts on, yeah, if it's okay to go this route, and if you don't want to, we can totally go a different direction. But I am curious what you think of what, and especially since you have more personal experience with oaks than the average, peon layman like Gene and I, who are never, important enough to have those associations, or in proximity to have those. What do you how do you think the church would be different if Oaks had been prophet all this time, instead of Nelson, if he was before President Nelson? Or what do you think he'll be like after? Or do you think a lot of what's behind Nelson, like he is already behind a lot of it? I'm very curious your thoughts on that. If you care to share, if there's more interesting places you'd rather go, we can do that.
No, I'm happy to address the question. I'm not sure I can be, I mean, I don't have any inside information, really. I don't think. The Quorum of the 12
Just
is a very
your thoughts in
problematic,
general.
it's
Sorry,
a
go
very,
ahead.
Quorum of 12 is a very problematical institution, which goes back to August of 1844 in Nauvoo. After Joseph Smith died in June of 1844, the question was who should succeed him. And the issue was whether it should be Sidney Rigdon. At the trial of Sidney Rigdon, which took place in the Bowery in Nauvoo in August of 1844, the judges were the High Council of Zion, located, headed by William Marks. And the Rigdon was basically on trial. And the witnesses against him were the 12 apostles. They were the witnesses against him. And the question wasn't whether the apostles should succeed Joseph Smith. The question was whether Sidney Rigdon should succeed. And the arguments made by the apostles was that the reason why Sidney Rigdon shouldn't be made the guardian of the church or shouldn't succeed Joseph Smith was because he hadn't received his full endowment. He hadn't received what we would now call the second anointing. And we know this because we have the transcripts of we have the report of the meeting that appeared in the Times and Seasons. William W. Phelps got up and said, look, Sidney Rigdon is just not a member. I've tried to get him to get his full blessings, but he's not been fully anointed. And
he wasn't in the inner circle.
Yeah, he wasn't. Well, he didn't have the fullness of the priesthood through the temple. He wasn't a member of the quorum of the anointed, which consisted of both men and women who had been anointed to the fullness of the priesthood. And so I believe the actual successor to Joseph Smith was not a person. It wasn't his son. It wasn't the quorum of the 12. It was the quorum of the fully anointed men and women, which actually ran the church for 18 months prior to Joseph Smith's death.
Right. So at that time, actually, Emma Smith had more priesthood than Sidney Rigdon.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Emma Smith was the joint president of the anointed quorum. She actually had the right to succeed to the presidency of the church. And Brigham Young understood this, which is why he blocked it, because Brigham Young was a great misogynist and a great racist.
He hated Emma.
And he was a great colonizer. He certainly understood money and railroads and how to create a colony. And, that he's kind of like
land deals.
But he said, I'm no prophet. Whereas Joseph Smith, who had aspirations to become that kind of a leader, was never very good at it because he had his head in more mystical things. And it's very difficult to translate mystical things into practical, administrative, churchy things. It doesn't work very well. And that's why we lost a lot. I think the one and only prophet we've ever had was Joseph Smith. And I think he's difficult because we do not know how to deal with the kind of mysticism that he was involved in. There's a tradition of mysticism in Hinduism, in Christianity, in Islam, even in Judaism, Kabbalistic Judaism, which he was more in line with. And because Mormon theologians almost don't exist, and because Mormon historians are not able to deal with theology very well, they can't connect Joseph Smith to, Mechthild of Magdeburg or some of the Christian mystics. I can't remember their names now.
I wouldn't recognize them anyway.
These women,
Yeah.
female mystics, and male mystics, like St. Francis of Assisi. His experiences are more like that, or even Swedenborg or William Blake, who's a great English writer who was a mystic. If you were to read those and connect them to Joseph Smith's, what he says about the first vision and other things he says in some of his revelations, you see that there is a link, and it's not a link we like to see in Mormonism.
That's right. I was thinking, Brigham Young has been called the Lion of the Lord, but in a way, he really was the lie of the Lord.
Well,
in many ways.
I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say that. I think he's limited. I mean, I think most of us in Mormonism are limited by the fact that we're too literalistic. We don't want to see multiple meanings in a single utterance. The idea that you read a scripture and you just think you just see it in one way. God speaks in layers of simultaneity, and that's why it's very difficult to do theology.
Yeah,
you know.
I have a question, kind of going back to Oakes. You were talking about the first time he had you in, and what he was concerned over what you wrote. I don't know how many meetings you had. I've heard other stories of things. So is this something that kind of repeated as you got in trouble over the years, or is this the one time that you sat in his office where he expressed concerns about what you wrote and what you said to him?
Well, I had a few meetings with him when I was his research assistant, but they were about the research I was doing that had nothing to do with theology. And the one meeting I did have with him was back in 1984, and that did not repeat. When I got excommunicated, my friend was his clerk when he was the Supreme Court justice. My friend was a lawyer, and he became Dallin Oakes's clerk, judicial clerk. So they knew each other. They were very close. And after I got excommunicated, my friend said to Dallin, after he became an apostle, really, you ought to meet with Paul again. And he said, no, I can't do that. When my friend, after I was excommunicated in 93, there could be no more contact of any kind. My friend, Daniel Rector, who was the son of Hartman Rector Jr., was one of the 70. And he was a very close friend of mine. Their family, I was very close to their family. When Daniel died, he fell off. He was hiking and he got killed when he fell off a mountain in 2002. And his father, Hartman Rector, who was then a general authority, wanted me to speak at his funeral because I was very close to them. And he called James Faust, who was in the first presidency. And I was there when he called him. He said, President Faust, I'd like Paul Toscano to speak at the funeral of Daniel. And he didn't have to explain to James Faust who I was, because James Faust knew who I was. And James Faust says, no, absolutely not. We can't have him speaking at the funeral.
You were blacklisted.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I spoke at the graveside, though, when we dedicated the grave, but I wasn't allowed to speak at the funeral. And not only was I blacklisted, blacklisted both by the leaders of the church and by Mormon intellectuals, both right. From the left and right.
And Daniel, Daniel was working at Signature at the time, or?
Daniel was not. He was working. He had some job. I can't remember what it was. I had worked with him at CFS, which was where Steve Christensen and I worked. I was there when Steve was killed by Hoffman's bomb. But I don't want to digress too much, because what I was going to say was at the time they wouldn't want to talk to me. I mean, James Faust said, no, he can't speak. But also they removed me from the index of church publications. So if you were to go to the official index of church publications and look up Paul Toscano, you will not find the articles I wrote for the Ensign or the articles that I wrote for the New Era for the youth. There was a number of articles that appeared there, maybe 10 or 12, and they were written under my authorship because I not only helped other people edit their work, but I also wrote. And when I was an editor of the Ensign, and you can't find them anymore. They're not listed under my name. They have no authorship.
Even
So
though they
I
weren't, even though they
from all
weren't,
the
they weren't heretical at the time, but your
No.
name became a heresy.
Yeah, and on the left, I mean, Margaret and my work, I mean, she's done a huge amount of scholarship, both on Mormonism and women in priesthood and Heavenly Mother, but also in classical languages in Greek. And she's done studies of, the uses of Greek themes in film. She's just a scholar that's got a worldwide reputation. But in Mormonism, we are never quoted by, the Mormon historians that are in, because they basically silently sustain the stigma of excommunication. It's so you get
The soft
They
shell.
have to show the party line there, because you're poison now, and your association, it's a virus that can spread. I don't think we finished the story with Oakes. He called you into his office. We just got the beginning of that. But we didn't. I think, but then we diverged into other things. So are we? Can we go back to that and finish? How did that go?
Well, I think the interview lasted maybe an hour. And what we were basically talking about was a chapter in my book, Gospel Letters to a Mormon Missionary, in which I argued, and I think correctly, from section 121, that the priesthood, in order to have the priesthood, you both have to have an ordination somehow, and charismatic gifts. It requires both
So
the
line of
rights
authority.
of the priesthood and the rights of the priesthood and the powers of heaven. And I said, and I was arguing with him about state presidents and mission presidents who obviously are installed properly, but they aren't very spiritual. Especially mission presidents who are interested in statistics and numbers and creating all kinds of problems. I mean, like you had the baseball baptisms was an example of that, and in England, and mess that it made. And
Soccer in Argentina.
Yeah, soccer, right, where you're interested not in the conversion of people, but just getting numbers into the church, which I felt was an example of this failure to have some spiritual gifts.
The missionaries' leadership as sales executives. And also, didn't Nibley say something of beware of the management?
Yeah, I was at that speech where he talked about managers.
Beware the managers.
Ezra Benson was on the stand. Ezra Benson was present, who liked it. I don't know if he understood it, because I don't know whether he got the subversive, the subversive sub-theme. But basically he's saying you can manage the church to hell. And it's because Christianity is not about ecclesiology. It's not about management. It's about spirituality.
Yeah, I remember growing up hearing that the family was the basic unit of the church. And now it seems like everything has to go through headquarters.
Well, the problem with the family, Jesus said, you must leave father and mother. Jesus was not for the biological family. He was for the spiritual family, the family of Christ, based not upon birth, but on rebirth. The whole idea was that you would, I have nothing against a family. I mean, we should have good families, but good families go sour if there isn't a spiritual dimension to the family. Otherwise, it's just patriarchal corporation where the father is giving orders and the mother is working for free and cleaning up after, and the kids are supposed to follow some kind of model. It's horrible. It's not like the Donna Reed show.
Obedience.
Yeah, it becomes pray, pay, and obey. It's just awful. But what Christ was talking about was something completely different. It's not that it was against the family. It just recognizes the fact that the biological family is fallen. There's opacity of mind, there's egocentricity, there's there's selfishness, there's baggage there, and it's not based on the biological family. So the 1995 Proclamation on the Family, which I think was largely written by Dallin Oaks, is a heresy because it idolizes the biological family and ignores the teachings of Jesus. It's just not Christian.
And one other thing about that, the gospel of obedience is dangerously close to Satan's plan.
Well, that's what I say. Obedience is not the first law of heaven; it's the first law of hell. And
yeah,
I don't know why. Yeah, it's just despotism. But then again, freedom is a terrifying reality.
To leadership.
I mean, Jesus calls us to freedom, but people don't want freedom because freedom means you have to judge with your own judgment. And you can't just pass your judgment on to somebody else and say, oh, I'm just following orders. That's what the Nazis said at the Nuremberg trials. We were just following orders. People want that. They want that because it exculpates them. You don't judge with your own judgment. The freedom that Christ gives us is terrifying because we have to decide for ourselves and stand upon our own judgment. And we will be judged by our judgment. And how do you live with that? Well, it requires humility and repentance and forgiveness constantly. It's not about arrogance, and it's not about certainty, and it's not about how certain you are about your testimony. It's about humility and forgiveness and repentance and these things, compassion. And I'm sorry to say that the idea of obedience is just directly repugnant to the teachings of Jesus.
And that's directly opposed to becoming like him.
Absolutely. You can become like him when either you're an oppressor or one of the oppressed. I mean, you cannot be like him. The way of the cross is freedom, but it's a terrifying thing. People give it up all the time. That's why all these Trump voters give up their freedom. They want to give their freedom up to a strong man who's going to make things right, and that's never going to happen.
That's right. So
we had said before, and I don't know, Gene, sorry if you had a.
No, go ahead.
I could go to you, but because I'm thinking of wrapping up with something that you had said before when we were talking before we started the show, just about your age and just kind of wanting to get stuff written down or that hasn't been, and that Margaret was helping you remember a lot of these things. Are there is there anything that you're worried about will be lost from the rest of us forever from you if it doesn't get written down? Do you have an autobiography in the works or anything like that, or how do you feel about that? But first, I want to see if Gene was going to keep going with what you were saying before. Did you want?
Well, I've written.
That sounds like a good wrap up for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just saying, look, I've written 17 books. This one is on the Supreme Court's decision, but it's the Supreme Court's decision, Invisible Religion in the Public Schools. Margaret and I wrote Strangers in Paradox in 1990, which is a Mormon theology. I wrote a memoir called Road to Exile, which it says the conversion and excommunication of a Mormon misfit. And I've written several novels. One of my favorites is Christ on Trial, and another one that I wrote recently is called Driving Jesus. And so I have written a lot of things. I'm 79 now. I'm 79 now, and I don't know what else I can write. As to whether it will be lost, well, it's all online, but I don't think people are interested in the theological discourse of an excommunicant. So it might be lost simply because of, Boyd Packer stigmatizing my status.
And in a way, Jesus was excommunicated from his group of people, we could say.
Yeah, Jesus was
Maybe someday, Paul, you'll have a following, a posthumous following. They'll find these things that have been hidden from them, and they'll think this is
Your
really
church
great.
will be called the PT Cruisers.
Well, I hope that no church evolves from it. I never thought that. I was just hoping that people would open their minds to possibilities of other interpretations. I would be glad of that, and that they would focus more on Christ than on his church or the texts or the history, but they would engage in a personal relationship. It's very, I find that it's very difficult to do that if you're obeying another master.
Right. And one of the things that's identified by Stephen Hassan as cult behavior is control of thought. That is the sure sign of a cult, along with control of information and behavior and emotions. And so anyway,
Absolutely.
So yeah, so with to you, the true gospel of Jesus would be the opposite of control. It would be freedom of behavior, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of emotion,
and equality, compassion,
growing amidst those things, not stifling them and controlling them.
Right.
That's a gospel I could get behind.
There you go.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me. Brave souls you are.
We're going to have Paul on every week until he dies. No, I'm just kidding. We'll have Paul on again in the future and for some other subject matters. But thank you so much to all our viewers. We'd like you to like and subscribe, and have a nice summer. And we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.